Let's get the latest now from New York, where global leaders have gathered at the United Nations. The key focus is the slow progress on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals aim to tackle poverty, inequality, climate change and the economy, among other global challenges. I'm joined now by William Denselow in New York. William, thanks for speaking to us. Can you give us a wrap of the day's events at the 78th United Nations General Assembly?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, essentially, the big order of business is the fact that world leaders have started to address the international community. We've heard from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, laying out his visions for the international community. As you mentioned, getting the Sustainable Development Goals back on track was a major focus of that. He, of course, heading into a high-level week here in New York, was urging leaders not just to bring a lofty rhetoric, but to bring a willingness to find compromises on a number of crises around the world, as well as to bring tangible solutions and essentially donations to the table when it comes to contributions to things like funding for helping mitigate the impacts of climate change and getting those SDGs back on track as well. When it comes to President Biden's speech, well, a large part of it was, of course, portioned to the war in Ukraine. He said essentially that Russia's actions were naked aggression, urging nations to do more to stay steadfast in their support for Ukraine. We also, of course, heard from South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, who also had a bilateral meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ramaphosa stating that he was committed to upholding the UN Charter. In his speech, he also urged the international community to do their part to really help with the SDGs. He said that wealthy nations had to pay their fair share, whether it comes to climate change or a wider financing package to do things like helping alleviate poverty, hunger around the world.
William, just coming back to those Sustainable Development Goals, we're about halfway to 2030, and this summit as part of the United Nations General Assembly is possibly a really good opportunity not only to take stock and to reinvigorate leaders with regards to achieving those goals, but also perhaps to realign. Do you get a sense from any of these leaders that perhaps pulling back on some of those initial goals is going to have to be the only route, where failures on some of those fronts are inevitable?
We're not hearing any kind of talk of scaling back those incredibly ambitious goals, like you rightly said. Back in 2015, there were 17 lofty targets that presented things like ending hunger, reducing poverty, addressing inequalities around the world, and of course, tackling climate change. At the moment, though, we're at the halfway mark ahead of the 2030 deadline. And what we're seeing is that at this halfway stage, just 15% of the Sustainable Development Goals are currently on track. Around a third, according to some estimates, are heading in reverse, largely due to major consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, global conflicts that we continue to see in parts of the world as well. We are seeing, though, tangible action plans going forward. The United Nations has reiterated a call for the international community to pay to the tune of $500 billion each and every year to help especially developing nations get back on track. A major part of the high-level week here is on addressing the needs of the global south, especially when it comes to financing, to helping address these things that have been laid out in the SDGs.
Any curveballs expected or topics that are expected to be especially contentious?
Well, when it comes to financing, of course, there is always real concerns that there'll be lofty promises made at the General Assembly, and then much of those promises fall short. That is why there are real calls yet again to make sure that we not only see pledges but action going forward as well. Of course, we have this $500 billion allocation, but that's not just where the hopes for the UN last. What they want to see is greater reform when it comes to financial institutions, to see debt restructuring going forward as well. It's estimated, and this was a message from the UN Secretary General, that the African continent spends more on its debts than it does on healthcare. That is something that the UN Secretary General drastically wants to see addressed, and says that especially wealthier nations can do far more when it comes to alleviating these systemic issues. Essentially, message from the UN is that many of these institutions, like the UN behind me, they've been in place for over 70 years. The world has changed since then. The fear is that institutions like this have not. The call is for that to change.
William, last question for you. In the course of history, certain world leaders have used the stage at the United Nations General Assembly to make charged statements, some of them speaking for as long as 2 to 3 hours. We remember some of those names in history. Fidel Castro, former president of the US, Donald Trump. He's also been quoted widely from his speech at the UN General Assembly. Anyone of the world leaders who've already taken to the stage standing out for you at this point as someone to really remember for their impact or strong words?
Well, perhaps the biggest attendee that will be giving an address throughout High Level Week is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He is currently speaking to members of the international community at the General Assembly Hall behind me. Of course, he addressed the United Nations last year, but it was virtual, so there are real thoughts that this could be a far more fiery, far more impactful address to world leaders. He's expected to essentially have a message of support for Ukraine going forward, and urging members of the international community to not get a war fatigue. We're over 18 months in since the full-scale invasion. There are concerns among some of Ukraine's allies that their counteroffensive isn't making the headway that it could have, perhaps should have done. There are fears over what the war is doing when it comes to global food prices. The hope, as far as Kyiv is concerned, is that Volodymyr Zelensky can not only solidify the support of his existing allies, but perhaps in the chambers of the United Nations, and whether it's public speeches or conversations behind closed doors, to perhaps win over some new friends too.
William, before I do let you go, one more question. So finances, global conflicts, climate change, the SDGs, all on the agenda, but a notable issue also up for discussion is global health issues. That's completely understandable given the impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the world over the last 3 years. Possibly leaders talking about, how to prevent pandemics going forward, but also inequities in terms of access to healthcare, very big on the agenda, especially for developing countries. Who do you think is pushing hardest on that front?
Yeah, there are a couple of very high-level summits when it comes to global health. One on pandemic preparedness and prevention going forward, another on tuberculosis as well. Really, it's been no secret that plenty of the rhetoric we've seen really since the height of the COVID-19 pandemic is the inequalities around the world that it has laid bare, especially if we take into consideration something like the vaccine rollout, where wealthier nations got vaccines, were getting booster shots before many nations around the world, even first responders, even healthcare workers in developing nations were still yet to receive a single COVID-19 vaccine shot. We can expect many of those nations that feel hard done by, feel let down by the pandemic, by the response globally by the pandemic, to be very vocal in that, to make sure that these kind of things don't happen again, to perhaps hope that there's a better mechanism going forward to make sure that vaccines, whoever produces them with more equity in mind. There's also, of course, the financial impact to be considered. We've seen such wide-ranging economic ramifications from the pandemic. So, as you rightly say, those kind of impacts, how to better address the economic woes caused by a global pandemic, how to address these going forward as well.
Thank you so much, William Denselow, coming to us from New York, where we will stay.